Hi everybody, this is Johnnie. I am sharing this workbook for the edTPA. You can find this workbook for you to use in a link below in the description. This workbook will cover Literacy Planning Task 1 and the commentary. I'll be going over all of the prompts, giving you some direction about the prompts, and then offering starters to help you with the writing. You will see that I offer starters for every one of the prompts, and I hope this will be helpful to you. So let's get started. So for Literacy Planning Task 1 commentary, in Literacy Planning Task 1, you will write a commentary responding to the prompts below. Your commentary should be no more than 9 single-space pages, including the prompts. So the first one is the central focus. Describe the central focus in the essential literacy strategy for comprehending or composing text you will teach in the learning segment. This means your learning segment should be either a set of lessons on reading for comprehension or writing for composing text. Here's a starter for you. The central focus for my learning segment is, and some suggestions, writing a personal narrative, constructing a how-to story, understanding story arc. And here's a definition from edTPA about central focus. A description of the important understandings and core concepts that you want students to develop within the learning segment. The central focus should go beyond a list of facts and skills, align with content standards and learning objectives, and address the subject-specific components in the learning segment. In elementary literacy, the central focus is an overarching big idea for student learning in literacy. The subject-specific components for the elementary literacy central focus also include A, an essential literacy strategy tied to the central focus, and B, related skills. For example, the central focus for a primary grade learning segment might be retelling. The learning segment would focus on the essential literacy strategy, example, summarizing a story, and related skills, decoding, recalling, sequencing. The central focus for an upper elementary learning segment might be persuasive writing. The learning segment would focus on the essential literacy strategy, using evidence to support an argument, and related skills, examples, writing paragraphs, using correct verb tense or other conventions. So there's a chart that follows. 2 important things here: essential literacy strategy, and then related skills. They'll come up again and again. So we'll come down here, and the essential literacy strategy for my learning segment is, and here's the definition for this one. Essential literacy strategy, an approach selected deliberately by a reader or writer to comprehend or compose text. When students are able to select and use strategies automatically, they have achieved independence in using the strategy to accomplish reading and writing goals. For elementary literacy, the essential literacy strategy is a specific strategy for comprehending or composing text that you will teach across your learning segment lessons. It should be clearly tied to your segment's central focus and stem from that big, overarching idea for student learning in literacy. Example strategies for reading include summarizing a story, comparing and contrasting first-hand and second-hand accounts of the same event, using evidence to predict, interpreting a character's feelings, or drawing conclusions from informational text. Example strategies for writing include organizing ideas before writing, note-taking from informational text to support drafting a topic, using graphic organizers to organize writing, using a rubric to revise a draft, or using quotes as evidence to support an argument. And look in making good choices to get further direction on this. On 1B, the prompt is, given the central focus, describe how the standards and learning objectives within your learning segment address the essential literacy strategy, related skills that support use of the strategy, and reading and writing connections. Now, I just read to you about the essential literacy strategy. The related skills, literacy skills that students will develop and practice while learning an essential literacy strategy for comprehending or composing text within the learning segment. These skills should help students understand and apply the essential literacy strategy that you are teaching. So don't confuse these with prerequisite skills, and look at making good choices to get further direction on this. In reading and writing connections, support students' literacy development through an explicit understanding that many of the skills that are taught in reading instruction are also beneficial to young writers. Students gain insight on how the processes of reading and writing are interdependent, thereby reinforcing their understanding of the varied purposes of texts, how texts are organized, how to make meaning from text, and how writers develop their craft. Examples of learning tasks that support reading-writing connections include reading or researching informational text to inform an essay, journal writing to make predictions, making personal or text-to-text connections, writing book reviews or alternative endings to stories, or writing in a style that emulates a model. So, essential literacy, strategy, related skills, reading-writing connections. First, you want to set out the standards, then follow with the learning objectives based on the standards. So the starter might be, the literacy standards that my learning segment addresses are, and think about what your state is asking. The learning objectives for my learning segment based on these standards are, so first you talk about literacy standards, then you talk about learning objectives. Now you go to the first piece, which is the essential literacy strategy. The essential literacy strategy for my learning segment addresses these standards and learning objectives. So you want to follow with how your essential literacy strategy matches or fits with the standards and objectives. So you've got the standards and your objectives. Why this essential literacy strategy? And again, the related skills that support the use of the essential literacy strategy are, you want to describe these. These fit with these standards and learning objectives, and follow with how they do that, the related skills. And the last piece is reading and writing connections. The reading and writing connections in my learning segment are, describe these. These fit with these standards and learning objectives, and you follow with how. So on this prompt 1B, it's all about standards and learning objectives and how they connect to these three: essential literacy strategy, related skills, and reading-writing connections. And you have prompts for each of those. Let's go to 1C. Explain how your plans build on each other to help students make connections between the essential literacy strategy to comprehend or compose text and related skills that support use of the strategy in meaningful contexts. This part, plans build on each other, is actually one of the rubrics, so you need to make sure you give this good attention. My suggestion is that you be purposeful and sequential here. Some starters for you. The first one is setting the stage, what your first lesson is going to be about. The first lesson of my learning segment will describe the focus of the lesson and what students will know or be able to do as a result of the teaching. That's pretty straightforward. What happens is every subsequent lesson needs to talk about how it builds off lessons beforehand. So for the second lesson of my learning segment builds off the first by, describe how the lesson moves the learning, emphasizing how it connects to the essential literacy strategy and related skills. This lesson moves students' understanding towards the essential literacy strategy by, and explain. So that's the second lesson, and then you want to follow with every other lesson that follows after that. The third lesson of my learning segment builds off the second and first lessons by, again, refer to the essential literacy strategy and related skills. This lesson moves students' understanding towards the essential literacy strategy by. So let's go back up here. Explain how your plans build on each other. Okay. And so you set out the first lesson, and then you have to talk about each lesson after that building off the ones that came before. Second lesson builds off. Third lesson builds off the second and first lessons by. Let's go to prompt 2. Knowledge of students to inform teaching. For each of the prompts below, describe what you know about your students with respect to the central focus of the learning segment. And you want to consider a variety of learners in your class who may require different strategies and support. IEPs, 504s, English learners, struggling readers, underperforming students, gaps in academic knowledge, and gifted students perhaps. So the first part under 2, prior academic learning and prerequisite skills related to the central focus. Cite evidence of what students know, what they can do, and what they are still learning to do. So when you're given a list of things to do, separate and address each one. You have 3 things here: know, can do, and still are learning to do. Here's a definition for prior academic learning and prerequisite skills. These include students' content knowledge and skills, as well as academic experiences developed prior to the learning segment. So here's some starters for you. In relation to the central focus of my learning segment, my students know, describe prior knowledge that students bring to the learning segment. My students are able to describe what they are able to do, skills and abilities that they bring to the learning segment. And then finally, my students are still learning to describe what they have been working on in reading or writing that relates to the central focus. A couple things here. You want to keep focusing on what they're bringing to the learning segment. This isn't about any kind of prior knowledge. This is prior knowledge that relates to what you're teaching. You will also notice that the prompt asked about what students know, what they can do, and what they're still learning to do. You will see that you need to address each one. Know, able to do, learning to. And now let's go to B. Personal, cultural, and community assets related to the central focus. What do you know about your students' everyday experiences, cultural and language backgrounds, and practices and interests? So this one's a thick one. So let's think about this here. Think about how reading and or writing matter to your kids in their larger life, not just school. Do they have experience with storytelling, song, books at home, or at the local library? How does the content of the text you are reading or the prompts of the writing they are doing have personal or cultural connection? So TPA describes assets, knowledge of students, this way. Starting with personal, refers to specific background information that students bring to the learning environment. Students may bring interests, knowledge, everyday experiences, family backgrounds, and so on, which a teacher can draw upon to support learning. Under cultural, refers to the cultural backgrounds and practices that students bring to the learning environment, such as traditions, languages and dialects, worldviews, literature, art, and so on, that a teacher can draw upon to support learning. And under community, refers to common backgrounds and experiences that students bring from the community where they live, such as resources, local landmarks, community events and practices, and so on, that a teacher can draw upon to support learning. So we're thinking about assets here. Here's some starters. The central focus of my learning segment relates to my students' personal, cultural, and community assets by, follow with a description. You might want to take it apart. You might have a sentence or two about their personal assets, things that matter to them, that interest them. You might have a sentence or two about cultural assets, what they bring to their learning from the ways their families live and their languages. And community assets, what is it about the places where they live that offer things for their learning? Many of my students experience literacy at home through, describe what experiences your kids have, be generous with all the ways that they intersect with language, through talk, varieties of text, storytelling. So that's addressing personal, cultural, and community assets related to the central focus. For 3, we're supporting students' literacy learning. You want to respond to the prompts below. To support your justifications, refer to the instructional materials and lesson plans you have included as part of Literacy Planning Task 1. In addition, principles from research and/or theory to support your justifications. So let's look at A. Justify how your understanding of your students' prior academic learning and personal, cultural, and community assets from the prompts above guided your choice or adaptation of learning tasks and materials. Be explicit about the connections between the learning tasks and students' prior academic learning, their assets, and research theory. Okay? 2 primary ones are prior academic learning and then assets, personal, culture, community. And you do want to make some connection to theory as well. So my suggestion here, tell the story of your students. Do this in 2 parts. The first part should describe the academic learning that sets them up for your learning segment. So what do they bring to your learning already? Prior academic learning. The second should restate from above their assets and then connect those to what is to be learned. Okay? So prior academic learning, personal, cultural, and community assets. So coming down here, prior academic learning and prerequisite skills. I've given you a definition of that already. And here again is definitions about assets, personal, cultural, and community. So here are some starters. First part. In my learning segment, I will set out the following learning tasks. Give a brief description of each learning task or the learning focus for each of the lessons. Follow with, I am basing my learning tasks on my students' prior academic knowledge related to my central focus. Describe how. And to continue, my choice for learning tasks is based on, here you want to share a theory or two of learning, and especially theories on literacy. So all of this is about prior academic learning, and you want to have some connection to theory. The second part is all about assets. Let's start with this. The texts we are using for this learning segment relate to students' backgrounds by, describe how. The focus of our writing relates to students and continue everyday experiences, cultural language backgrounds, or interests by. This could be the focus of their reading. So how does this connect to their assets? And to continue, my choice for learning tasks related to students' cultural assets is based on share a theory or two of learning, and especially theories on culture and learning. So this one was about prior academic learning, personal, cultural, and community assets, and some links to learning theory. So we took care of those within these starters. The first part was about prior academic learning, second part about assets, and last was about connecting to theory as well. For B, describe and justify why your instructional strategies and plan supports are appropriate for the whole class, individuals, and or groups of students with specific learning needs. And again, consider these students, IEPs, 504s, English learners, struggling readers, etc. Again, when a list is set out, give attention to each element. You want to think about the whole class, individuals, and groups of students with learning needs. So here's some starters. First one is set out for whole class. The following planned instructional strategies and supports are appropriate for the whole class. Name the general instructional strategies you will employ. So this is overarching. Now you want to get to details here about strategies. The instructional strategy, name the strategy, supports students' learning towards the central focus by, so a particular instructional strategy here. And if you have others, then you continue. The instructional strategy, name the strategy, supports student learning towards the central focus by, and describe it. So you have overarching strategies and you have particular strategies you describe here. So this is for the whole class. Now for individuals, a number of my students need particular support in, and describe that. I will support them by, and describe how you will do that. And then if you have specific learning needs, I have a student with an IEP who needs support in, describe. I will support them by, describe. So for this prompt, it was about whole class, individuals, and groups. So you want to make sure you address all of those. For C, describe common developmental approximations or common misconceptions within your literacy central focus and how you will address them. This one is a bit tricky. Do your best by this and don't worry if you don't quite feel you have this one right. It's work for everyone. It's best to talk with your mentor teacher about what confusion students come up with as they have done this learning segment in the past. So your mentor teacher knows there's going to be very particular places where kids get stuck in this particular learning segment or learning unit. And you can talk about it and talk to your mentor teacher about what strategies that your mentor teacher uses to make it work for kids. Here's a definition. Misconception. For literacy, Includes confusion about a strategy or skill. Examples: misunderstanding about text purpose and structure, application of a skill or multiple meaning words. For mathematics, a misconception stems from an erroneous framework about mathematical relationships or concepts, sometimes based on informal generalizations from experience. For example, a student may believe that multiplying two numbers always results in a larger number than either of the numbers being multiplied. This misconception is likely to cause difficulty when learning to multiply fractions. Again, keep it simple. Starter. Most students, when engaging the central focus of my learning segment, are able to. So start with the positive. What are they able to do? Most students, when engaging in the central focus of my learning segment, are able to describe it. Some students may show some confusion with. I will address these misconceptions by and describe that. Okay, so the two parts here. You have to describe what the developmental approximations or misconceptions are. It's important, though, you have to address them. So there's two pieces here. All right? So what is the misconception that might come up? And then how will you address that? Two pieces for this one. And this is 4. Supporting literacy development through language. As you respond to prompts 4A through D, consider the range of students' language assets and needs. What do students already know? What are they struggling with? And or what is new to them? The first thing you need to define is the language function. Language function. Using information about your students' language assets and needs, identify one language function essential for students to develop and practice the literacy strategy within your central focus. Listed below are some sample language functions. You may choose one of these or another more appropriate for your learning segment. Most folks choose one of these. They're really good ones and they cover most things. Here's the definition for language function. The content and language focus of the learning task represented by the active verbs within the learning outcomes. Common language functions in the language arts include identifying main ideas and details, analyzing and interpreting characters and plots, arguing a position or point of view, predicting, evaluating, or interpreting an author's purpose, message, and use of setting, mood, or tone, comparing ideas between text, and so on. Again, keep it simple. Starter. The language function essential for students to develop and practice in my learning segment is, name the language function. You might follow with, this language function is important for my students to develop because, and describe why. This one's not complicated. All you want to do is identify one language function. You just have to say what that's going to be. For B, identify a key learning task from your plans that provides students with opportunities to practice using the language function in ways that support the essential literacy strategy. Identify the lesson in which the learning task occurs. Give lesson day a number. Okay, so a key learning task, and you have to say when it's going to happen. Definition for learning task includes activities, discussions, or other modes of participation that engage students to develop, practice, and apply skills and knowledge related to a specific learning goal. Learning tasks may be scaffolded to connect prior knowledge to new knowledge and often include formative assessment. A sample literacy learning task for 5th grade that is focused on writing an essay with an argument structure could be a discussion about a topic which students have strong opinions, like school uniforms, and draw from their everyday experiences constructing arguments to introduce the features of the genre. Over a unit of instruction, the teacher models various features while students read and analyze argument text on a variety of topics and develop their own argument essay. So for this prompt, I suggest focusing on a key learning task that best addresses the language function you just described above. And my starter: to bring students to better understand and use of the language function, name the language function, I will set out a learning task where we will describe what that task will be with an emphasis on students engaging with the language function. This learning task will have students engaging the language function by describe. This learning task will be in set out the lesson number and day. So let's go up here. Again, key learning task, opportunities to practice, give lesson day and number. Okay? So we want to say what the activity is going to be down here. You also want to say what the opportunities for practice when they engage the language function, and you want to set out the lesson number and day. All three of these things. The task, opportunities for practice, and what lesson day and number. For C, additional language demands. Given the language function and learning task identified above, describe the following associated language demands, written or oral, students need to understand and or use. So the first language demand is the language function. Then there are three others. Vocabulary or key phrases is one, syntax is another, and discourse is another. They bundle syntax and discourse together, but we'll go through each of them. So language demands. Specific ways that academic language, vocabulary, functions, discourse, syntax is used by students to participate in learning tasks through reading, writing, listening, and or speaking to demonstrate their disciplinary understanding. So I suggest here, first start with thinking about how your language function and the learning task will require students to use language, spoken or written. Then think about how the three, vocabulary, discourse, and syntax, each matter to how they will be using language. This is one of the more complicated prompts. Give it time and get help from others. My suggestion here is best to address all three, vocabulary, syntax, discourse. A definition for vocabulary includes words and phrases that are used within disciplines, including 1. Words and phrases with subject-specific meanings that differ from meanings used in everyday life. So table can be an everyday object next to the kitchen, or a table in math class might be something else. 2. General academic vocabulary used across disciplines, so like compare, analyze, evaluate. And 3. Subject-specific words defined for use in the discipline. So a starter for you. The language function, name, and my learning task will require students to engage in a variety of terms or vocabulary. And you want to follow describing these and how you will address this language demand, understanding this vocabulary. So this first starter is all about vocabulary. Okay. Second one's going to be about discourse. Discourse. Discourse includes the structures of written and oral language, as well as how members of the discipline talk, write, and participate in knowledge construction. Discipline-specific discourse has distinctive features or ways of structuring oral or written language, text structures, that provide useful ways for this content to be communicated. In the language arts and literacy, there are structures for composing, interpreting, and comprehending expository, narrative, poetic, journalistic, and graphic print materials, as well as video and live presentations. If the language function is to interpret character development, then appropriate language forms could include written essays with particular ways of citing textual evidence, or pattern sentences such as the author used, action, dialogue, and/or description, to introduce main character. One example of action, dialogue, and/or description was, which suggested that the character was. One way to think about this is what kinds of language, what kinds of talk need to happen in a group of people who are expert at something. So you can imagine chefs coming together to talk about their recipes. How would they talk about that differently than a couple of people who want to share recipes who are not experts? You might think about it as people who come to sew together. How do they talk about their work together? Or artists, or in the disciplines, how do mathematicians talk about the thing that they're doing? And what kinds of talk is necessary for people who write together, if you're in a writing club or such? In this case, you need to think about the kind of talk that has to happen to build better understandings of children as they are readers, So what do readers need to talk about with each other? How do they talk with each other? And writers. Writers talk about writing in certain ways. What kinds of things do you need to think about in the discourse, the ways of talking in your lessons regarding discourse? So here's a starter. The language function, name, and my learning task will require students to engage in discourse, talk and write in ways that encourage their learning. You want to follow with describing these and how you will address this language demand, talking and writing for understanding. So this is about discourse. The last one is about syntax. Definition: the set of conventions for organizing symbols, words, and phrases together into structures. So examples are sentences, graphs, tables. So think about how language is organized in spoken or written form so that it makes sense, and all the ways you might have to demonstrate or show to kids how the organization of the language helps them to understand what's being said or written. So a starter for this one: the language function, give it its name, and my learning task will require students to engage in forms of syntax in the language we are using. You want to follow with describing these and how you will address this language demand, giving attention to how language is organized in sentences and writing in the texts. So this prompt is all about additional language demands, language function being the first one, but the other ones are vocabulary, syntax, discourse. I've given you some definitions and prompts for each one. So this first one's going to be about vocabulary, then we're going to be thinking about discourse, and then we end up with syntax as the last one. For D, language supports, refer to your lesson plans and instructional materials as needed in your response to the prompt. Identify and describe the planned instructional supports during and or prior to the learning task to help students understand, develop, and use the identified language demands. So again, function, vocabulary, or key phrases, discourse, or syntax. Function is the first, vocabulary second, discourse, and then syntax. They define language supports this way: the scaffolds, representations, and pedagogical strategies teachers provide to help learners understand, use, and practice the concepts and language they need to learn within disciplines. The language supports planned within the lessons in edTPA should directly support learners to understand and use identified language demands, vocabulary, language function, and discourse or syntax, to deepen content understandings. Now they've set these out. Give attention to each of the four that have been set out. So the function, vocabulary, discourse, and syntax. My starters are for each one. To address the language demands that come with the language function, give its name, I will, and here you need to refer to which lesson, what teaching strategy, and what materials you will use to move students to understand, develop, and use that language function. Follow with my planned instructional supports will do this by. So we've talked about language function. Let's go to the next language demand. To address the language demands that come with vocabulary and key phrases, I will. And here you need to refer to which lesson, what teaching strategy, and what materials you will use to move students to understand, develop, and use that vocabulary. My planned instructional supports will do this by. Let's describe how. So that's vocabulary and key phrases. To address the language demands that come with the discourse of this learning segment, I will. So discourse now. Here, you need to refer to which lesson, what teaching strategy, and what materials you will use to move students to understand, develop, and use that discourse. My planned instructional supports will do this by. Describe. So that's discourse. And finally, syntax. To address the language demands that come with the syntax in this learning segment, I will. And here you need to refer to which lesson, what teaching strategy, and what materials you will use to move students to understand, develop, and use that syntax. My planned instructional supports will do this by, and give a description. So this one was all about identify and describe the planned instructional supports for the four: function, vocabulary, discourse, and syntax. So the prompts are all about supports, and you write something for each one of the 4. 5. Monitoring student learning. In response to the prompts below, refer to the assessments you will submit as part of the materials for Literacy Planning Task 1. Describe how your planned formal and informal assessments will provide direct evidence that students can use the essential literacy strategy to comprehend or compose text and related skills throughout the learning segment. So you want evidence and you want things to happen throughout the learning segment. This is all about your assessments. So let's start. Formal assessment. Assessments that you give and collect for recording purposes. Focuses on knowing what students know. Informal assessment. Checks for understanding along and during the instruction. Focuses on formative feedback. So this first one is collecting for records. The second one is for continuing to give feedback and direction to your kids. Formal and informal. So let's make sure we address both of those. A starter. I will set out the following formal assessments during my learning segment. Describe those. For each of those formal assessments, say, this formal assessment will give me evidence that students are learning the essential literacy strategy by showing. Describe. So what is it in the formal assessment that will show you what they've been learning? So this is formal assessment. And then follow with, I will engage in the following informal assessments and describe those. Those might be sitting with a group of students while they do reading or writing. These might be check-ins with individual students. This might be a closure discussion of what was going on in the lesson. And again, for each, this formal assessment will give me evidence that students are learning the essential literacy strategy by showing, and again, by showing, and describe what they're going to show you in terms of their learning. So in this prompt, it's about formal and informal assessments, what evidence they're going to give you, and how they show up throughout the learning segment. B. Explain how the design or adaptation of your planned assessments allows students with specific needs to demonstrate their learning. I suggest you might refer to and consider UDL guidelines here with a focus on representation. How are the different ways kids might show their understanding? Consider how to make the assessment accessible to students, how you set out the assessments, how to make the assessments multimodal. That means more than one way for kids to show their understanding. How to offer students choice in how they show their understanding. So starters for this, to address my student who has a learning need, so this is a particular kid with a particular need, in assessment I will describe. And more broadly, to address my students who struggle with, describe their struggle, I will organize my assessments to describe that. So now I'm going to be going over the literacy planning rubrics. Let's look at the first rubric. This one is Planning for Literacy Learning. How do the candidate's plans build on students' understanding of an essential literacy strategy for comprehending or composing text and the skills that support that strategy? With all the rubrics, you want to be aiming for at least level 3. And in order to get level 3, you have to meet all the requirements within that level. And so I've broken these down for you with each one of the rubrics. Let's read level 3 for rubric 1. Candidates' plans for instruction build on each other to support learning of the essential literacy strategy for comprehending or composing text with clear connections to skills. You can see there are 3 things here. The lessons build on each other, plans build on each other, they support learning, and there's clear connections to skills. So I write this over here. The plans need to build on each other, they need to support learning, and clear attention to the skills needed to meet the essential literacy strategy. So treat this one as having 3 elements to complete. So if you think about this as a checklist, see that you've done all 3 to meet level 3. Now to go to level 4, it's always useful to see what 4 has, because sometimes just a little bit more work will get you level 4. Candidates' plans for instruction build on each other within a meaningful context that supports learning of essential literacy strategy for comprehending or composing text with clear and consistent connections to related skills. So you can see again, plans building on each other means a lot, but what they build on and how they relate to the essential literacy strategy needs to be stronger. So I write down here, to get to level 4, describe how your lessons build on each other with constant reference to the purpose of the learning segment. And the last part here, clear and consistent connections, address related skills in every one of your lessons. Okay? So that moves you to level 4. And this is Rubric 1, Planning for Literacy Learning. Rubric 2, how does the candidate use knowledge of his or her students to target support for students' literacy learning? Okay? And under level 3, plan supports are tied to learning objectives and the central focus with attention to the characteristics of the class as a whole. I offer 2, supports focus on what students need to meet learning objectives. And the second one, supports describe attention to the whole class. Need to do both of these. So think of this as having 2 elements to complete. To move to level 4, plan supports are tied to learning objectives and the central focus. Supports address the needs of specific individuals or groups with similar needs. So you probably can see the difference right now. You need to address the class as a whole, but to move to level 4, you need to include more students. So to get to level 4, aside from describing how your supports matter to the needs of the class as a whole, give attention to students with IEPs, ELL students, students who need a challenge, students who come to the learning in different ways. So you're broadening your supports. So this is Rubric 2. This is Rubric 3. How does the candidate use knowledge of his/her students to justify instructional plans? So level 3 says, candidate justifies why instructional tasks or their adaptations are appropriate using examples of students' prior academic learning or personal, cultural, or community assets. Notice the 2 here, prior academic learning, personal, cultural, or community assets, and it's or. You have to address one of these 2. Candidate makes superficial connections to research and or theory. So I've written it out this way. You need to have clear detail about students' prior academic learning. You have to show that you know what their prior academic learning was or is. And the second part of this, your learning tasks need to be tied to students' prior academic learning. You show you know what it is, and you're showing that you're tying your instruction to that prior academic learning. Now you want to do the same for the assets. You need to give good detail about students' personal, cultural, or community assets. These need to be given attention in your planning, in your learning tasks. Okay? You know what these are, and they're in your learning tasks. And then you need to say something about research tied to literacy. They give you some wiggle room here. Candidate makes superficial connections to research and to theory. Do try to do better than being superficial. I suggest treating this one as having 5 elements to complete, like a checklist. To move to level 4, candidate justifies why learning tasks are appropriate using examples of, now notice the difference here, prior academic learning and personal, cultural, or community assets. So instead of being or in level 3, it's and. You need to do both. To get to level 4, learning tasks must be designed with prior academic learning in mind and personal, cultural, and community assets. Now you also want to strengthen the research part. References to research should not just be general education theories tacked on at the bottom, but research connected to your learning tasks, giving justification for the choices you are making in your planning. So you need to strengthen the connections to research or theory for this one too. So this is Rubric 3, using knowledge of students to inform teaching and learning. And this is Rubric 4. How does the candidate identify and support language demands associated with a key literacy learning task? And for level 3, general language supports address use of 2 or more language demands. Now remember, there are 4 of them: vocabulary, function, syntax, or discourse. So you need to do at least 2 of them. I suggest you do more. I suggest you address each of the language demands. Say something about supports for the language function. Say something about supports for vocabulary. Say something about supports for discourse. Say something about supports for syntax. Treat this one as having 4 elements to complete. To get to level 4, you might imagine what that is. Targeted language supports address use of vocabulary, language function, and then a choice between syntax and discourse. To get to level 4, you must describe supports for 3 of the 4 language demands. You must address vocabulary, you must address the language function, you must address syntax or discourse, and I suggest both would be better, and discourse is probably easier to address than syntax. The last one, Rubric 5, how are the formal and informal assessments selected or designed to monitor students' use of the essential literacy strategy to comprehend or compose text and related skills? So level 3 is the assessments provide evidence to monitor students' use of the essential literacy strategy and related skills. Okay? So based on this, I break it down into both informal and formal, because the prompt asks you to respond to both informal and formal kinds of assessments. Describe how your informal assessments give attention to the essential literacy strategy, because remember, it's essential literacy strategy, and describe how your informal assessments give attention to related skills. So essential literacy strategy, related skills, informal assessments. If we go down to formal assessment, describe how your formal assessment gives attention to the essential literacy strategy. Describe how your formal assessment gives attention to related skills. Okay, so this is, again, there are 2 things here: essential literacy strategy, related skills, and the kinds of assessments you use. I suggest treating this one as having 4 elements to complete. On level 4, the assessments provide multiple forms of evidence to monitor students' use of. So it's multiple forms here: essential literacy strategy and related skills, and then throughout the learning segment. And to get to level 4, this is what I suggest. Describe more than one informal approach to monitoring students' learning. Think about exit tickets, think about writing or reading conferences with students or groups of students. Think about informal check-ins during independent work. Describe how your formal assessment accounts for multiple aspects of student learning. So in your final assessment, there should be a few things that you're trying to see, get evidence of, related to your central focus and your central literacy strategy. And then some form of assessment needs to be evident in every one of your lessons throughout the learning segment. So every one of your lessons has some kind of informal for certain. There might be some exit ticket or more formal thing that comes along the way too. So you want to have it throughout the learning segment. And this is Rubric 5, Planning Assessments to Monitor and Support Student Learning. So I've gone through the rubrics. One last thing for you. This is an exemplar. This is an example of a strong commentary for Task 1. And this is a strong example. If yours is 80% the quality of the one below, you will be fine. Pay attention to how the responses are absolutely specific to the prompts. Notice how key terms from the prompts are woven into the responses, okay? So think about this, and think about this. And let's look at this first one. I'm going to change the size so we can see it a bit better. Okay, so this is planning commentary. This is 1. This first one's about central focus and essential literacy strategy. So you can see here, this person describes essential focus to start with, composing text, and then describes the essential literacy strategy and says what that is. This first one, 1A is easy. If we go to 1B, you can see it's a bit more work. This is about standards and learning objectives and these 3 things: the essential literacy strategy, related skills, and reading-writing connections. You can see that the essential literacy strategy is addressed in this first paragraph with connections to the standards. Related skills is given a second paragraph related to the standard. And the third one, reading-writing connections, third paragraph related to the standard. So each one of these is given attention because the prompt asks for something for each of them. If we go to 1C, explain how your plans build on each other. And as you could see above, plans building on each other is one of the rubrics. To help students make connections between the essential literacy strategy and related skills. So if we look through here, we can see that This person talks about the lessons building off each other. The first one, this lesson will establish the importance. That's the first lesson. The second lesson will build off. Lesson 3 will build off. And then throughout, this person talks about related skills, making connections, the essential literacy strategy, all of the things that matter here, making connections. And the last paragraph is making connections between these things to address the last part of the prompt. So every element of this prompt is found in what follows below. If we go to 2, this one is about the central focus. And you want to start with prior academic learning, what students know, what they can do, what they're still learning to do. You can see clearly that this person sets out in the first paragraph what the kids know, what students can do, and what they're still learning to do. And then again, a second paragraph, what students know, what students can do, and what they're still learning to do. So in each of the paragraphs addressing the 3 requirements for this prompt. If we go to 2b, this is personal cultural community assets. And so you can think about cultural assets, language backgrounds, interests. You can see that this person talks about languages, talks about culture in more than one way, talks about interests throughout. So this person does a good job of attaching ideas to each one of these in the prompt. If we go to 3a, this one is again prior academic learning and cultural and community assets. And you're talking about your learning tasks here and connecting to research and theory. So you can see again, this person talks about cultural assets and gives some connection to theory here. Gibbons comes up a lot in this particular task. Vygotsky here, Gibbons again. Some writing in this paragraph about prior knowledge, more prior knowledge, and some theory as well. So you can see this person addresses cultural and community assets, prior academic knowledge, and connects to theory throughout. And for B, describe and justify why your instructional strategies and plan supports are appropriate for the whole class, individuals and or groups, students with specific learning needs. Again, talking about the whole class. Also down here, talking about the whole class, talking about students with specific learning needs. You can see that throughout here. And then down here as well, I have 2 students with IEPs. So addressing again all the different students, groups of students. You will also see that this person continues to work in theory into the responses. On C, common developmental approximations and how they're going to be addressed. Starts right off with talking about what a misconception might be in this learning segment, and then how it will be addressed. Looks like there's another one here, another common mistake, and this person will follow with how to address that mistake. So that was whole class, individuals, groups, and students who need things along the way. And this was also common developmental approximations or common misconceptions, how they will be addressed. So let's look at 4. First one is define the language function, and this person does this in the first statement. And B, identify key learning task, opportunities to practice, and then where this lesson will occur. So the first one is identifying the key learning task. This person describes opportunities for practice and then says what lesson it will be on. Those are the things required for B. Under C, additional language demands, talking about vocabulary, syntax, and discourse. This person organized 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph's all about vocabulary. Second paragraph's about discourse. And the last paragraph's about syntax. And then under D, language supports, talk about planned instructional supports, giving attention to function, vocabulary, discourse, and syntax. So this one This person describes the supports throughout, but then makes sure to address each one of the four. So this is about discourse here, support in syntax, support vocabulary, and then support for the language function here. So meeting every one of those in this prompt. And under 5A, talk about planned formal and informal assessments throughout the learning segment. And so this person starts with formative assessments, giving it a paragraph, and then a paragraph about formal assessment. And they're talking about how the assessments show up in different lessons along the way to get out throughout the learning segment. And for B, explain how the design or adaptation of your planned assessments allows students with specific needs to demonstrate their learning. And you can see this person's gone through and talked about different groups of students and what kinds of supports they will get with the assessment, how the assessment will be made to work for them. So meeting every element of the prompt. So this was an exemplar, and as I said before, pay attention to how the responses are specific to the prompts. Notice how the key terms from the prompts are woven into the responses. I hope this has been helpful. So this workbook is on Literacy Planning Task 1, and we talked about the commentary, and I've shared with you every one of the prompts, some guidance, and starters for every one of them. I do hope this has been helpful for you.